If you are a fan of true crime and have seen the hugely popular documentary on Netflix, Making a Murderer, then you likely know the name Steven Avery. Steven Avery was convicted in 2005 of being responsible for the passing of Teresa Halbach. But it doesn't seem to be as simple as all that. I'm Adam Andrews with Where Are They Now, and today we're talking about none other than Steven Avery. Steven Avery was born July 9th, 1962 in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, where he was raised and lived with his family who owned a salvage yard in Two Rivers. From a young age, Steven was on a less than ideal path in life. Steven reportedly had an IQ of about 70 and didn't do too well in school, eventually dropping out when in high school. Like in 1981 when he was convicted of burglarizing a bar and later served 10 months in jail. The following year, in 1982, Steven pled guilty to animal cruelty after he poured gasoline on a sweet little kitty and tossed it into a bonfire, for which he was rightfully sentenced to 9 months. In 1985, he again found himself on the wrong side of the law when he forced a car driven by Sandra Morris off the road and pointed a firearm at her. Sandra was a cousin of his who was the wife of a sheriff's deputy, and according to Avery, his intention was to stop her spreading rumors about him allegedly exposing himself a number of times, which she filed a complaint for in 1984. For this crime, he was sentenced to 6 years but was granted bail. So Avery had a few run-ins with the law, making him a problem for the police in the area, and thanks to the issue with his cousin, who was a sheriff's deputy's wife, Avery was on extremely thin ice that began to crack and break. On July 29th, 1985, a woman named Penny Bernstein was unfortunately a victim of a attack on a beach near Two Rivers. Now, Penny gave a description of the assailant, and police believed that this description resembled the troubled Avery. After Bernstein picked him out of a photo lineup of suspects, Avery was arrested despite the fact that 16 people testified that he was elsewhere at the time of the attack. Further evidence provided by a state forensic official seemed to indicate a hair found on one of Avery's shirts that was consistent with that of the victim. 6 months after the attack, in December of 1985, Avery was convicted of the crime and sentenced to 32 years in prison. This is the beginning of Avery being allegedly falsely accused of crimes, and it is nowhere near the end. You see, many people had doubts about his guilt. In fact, another name came up in suspicion of the case. Another local man named Gregory A. Allen, who was suspected in other crimes. Interestingly though, law enforcement officials never investigated this suspect. Avery fought for and maintained his innocence of the crime, and his case got picked up by the Wisconsin Innocence Project in 2001. The project was granted a court order for DNA testing of a hair that had been found on the victim at the time of the crime. Now, in September of 2003, that same hair was matched to none other than Gregory A. Allen, thanks to new DNA analyzing technology. At the time, Allen was already in prison for another sexual-related crime. He was charged, and all charges held against Avery were dropped, with him being released from prison after serving 18 years falsely accused. Not too long after Avery was released from prison, he filed a wrongful conviction lawsuit against the county, the district attorney, and the sheriff for $36 million. In the proceedings of this lawsuit, it came to light that in 1995, 10 years after his imprisonment and 8 years before his release, detectives had learned that Gregory Allen, who was a prisoner in Brown County, literally confessed to committing a crime of the same nature in Manitowoc County that someone else was convicted of. And the authorities did absolutely nothing with that information. On October 31st, 2005, while the wrongful conviction lawsuit case was still going on, Teresa Halbach, a freelance photographer, drove to Avery's Auto Salvage, which is where Avery and other family members lived, in order to photograph a van that she wanted to list on Auto Trader magazine. According to Avery, he talked to her about the van, but that she left after taking the photographs. The problem is that unfortunately Teresa Halbach was never seen alive again. On November 3rd of that year, a missing persons report was filed, and a search was undertaken to locate Halbach. 2 days later, her vehicle was found on the outskirts of the Avery family's salvage yard. Over the following week, Halbach's car keys were discovered in Avery's house, with blood that belonged to Avery found in her car. In addition, human bones were recovered from a burn pit near Avery's home that were soon determined to belong to Teresa. And on top of that, more evidence was found that included a bullet found in Avery's garage that had Teresa's DNA on it. Avery was arrested, and while in jail, he settled his civil suit for $400,000, more than $35.5 million less than he originally sued for. Avery maintained that his charges were a framing by the police and justice system to discredit his pending civil case. Manitowoc County's police department did in fact cede control of the investigation over to the neighboring Calumet County Sheriff's Department due to Avery's lawsuit against Manitowoc County. But the agreement was for Calumet to use resources from Manitowoc County, including the county's personnel, meaning Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputies participated in the repeated searches of Avery's trailer, garage, and property, only supervised by Calumet County officers. It was ultimately two Manitowoc deputies who had been required to testify in Avery's civil suit who found the key to Halbach's vehicle in Avery's bedroom, although several earlier searches had come back with nothing. Avery's attorneys claimed that there was a huge conflict of interest in the Manitowoc personnel's participation and suggested evidence tampering. To add to the car key evidence found by a Manitowoc deputy, Avery's attorneys also discovered that an evidence box containing a vial of Avery's blood that was collected in 1996 during his appeals efforts in the Bernstein case had been unsealed and contained what they believed to be a new puncture hole visible in the stopper. Steven's attorney brought to the court the idea that the blood found in Halbach's car could have been drawn from the stored vial and planted in the vehicle to incriminate Avery. To combat this claim, the prosecution presented testimony by FBI technicians who had tested the blood recovered from Halbach's car for EDTA, which is an acid and a preservative that is used in blood vials, but is not found in the human body, and they found none in this blood sample. In March of 2006, Brendan Dassey, Steven Avery's 16-year-old nephew with an IQ in the borderline deficiency range, who was enrolled in special education classes and who stood as Steven's alibi, was interrogated by police investigating the case. Dassey was interrogated on 4 occasions over a 48-hour period, including 3 times in a 24-hour time frame with no legal representative, parent, or other adult present. During this interview, Brendan told detectives that he and Steven had committed the crimes. Now, the problem with these interrogations is that Dassey was interrogated via the Reed technique, a technique which was developed to encourage law enforcement officers to use tactics that pressure suspects to confess. Now, this in tandem with the fact that Dassey had been clinically evaluated as being highly suggestible, which makes a suspect more compliant and can ultimately lead to improper interrogation outcomes such as false confessions, led to a US magistrate judge describing his confession as clearly involuntary in a constitutional sense. But that opinion was overturned by an appellate court. Dassey later recanted, claiming that the confession was coerced. All the same, Dassey was charged with various crimes, even though there was no physical evidence against him. After a 27-day trial, Avery was found guilty of the crime as well as illegal possession of a firearm in March 2007. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later on in that same year, Brendan Dassey was also found guilty and given a life term, though he was eligible for parole, but in 2048. In 2015, Avery and Dassey drew international attention with the airing of Making a Murderer on Netflix. The 10-part series was made by Maura Demos and Laura Ricciardi, who first began working on the project in December 2005. While the program was an immediate hit with viewers, many of whom became amateur sleuths, a number of those involved in the case objected to how they were portrayed and claimed that the series omitted evidence that supported Avery's conviction. Afterwards, the legal battle for Brendan Dassey's confession, plus further battles for Avery's innocence, were chronicled in Making a Murderer Part 2 in 2018. Steven Avery is currently at the Waupun Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Wisconsin that housed 934 inmates as of June 2021. Avery's ex-fiancée, Sandy Greenman, has said that Avery is a model inmate who has never faced discipline or ever had an infraction against him. Greenman says she talks on the phone with Avery almost every day, but COVID restrictions had halted their in-person visits. Avery reportedly has his own cell, which he is not allowed to leave to eat. He usually only leaves his cell to shower, according to Greenman. And Steven regularly responds to letters from supporters and sometimes calls them or talks to them on Zoom. Greenman runs a Facebook group dedicated to Avery's innocence, and she often posts thank you notes which Avery addresses to the 22,000 members. Greenman believes Avery is legally barred from corresponding with Dassey, who is incarcerated at Oshkosh Correctional Institution in Wisconsin.
I mean, his initial idea was that I was involved somehow. He didn't know how, but he thought that I was involved somehow, I knew something, I was covering up for someone.
Falsely accused. It's a thing no one wants to be, but in a highly publicized case in a country that's not your own, where it's easy for the media to work against you, things can easily get out of hand. Today on Where Are They Now, I, Adam Andrews, will be telling you all about the case of Amanda Knox, whose wrongful conviction and subsequent media frenzy all but overshadowed the actual crime she was convicted and then acquitted of, the murder of Meredith Kercher. American citizen Amanda Knox, born July 9, 1987, moved to Perugia, the capital city of Umbria in central Italy, in 2007 at the age of 20 for an academic year, attending the University for Foreigners on exchange from the University of Washington in her home state of Seattle. Knox lived in a 4-bedroom ground floor apartment at Via della Pergola 7 with 3 other women. This is where she first met Meredith Kercher, born December 28, 1985, who was a 21-year-old British exchange student from the University of Leeds. Knox and Kercher lived with 2 Italian trainee lawyers in their late 20s, Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti. The lower level of the house was rented by 4 young Italian men with whom both Kercher and Knox were friendly and who were friends with one Rudy Guade, who both Kercher and Knox met late one night in mid-October after he had been invited into the lower level flat by some of the Italian tenants. In her time not spent studying, Amanda Knox worked part-time at a bar called Le Chic, which was owned by a Congolese man, Dia Patrick Lumumba. She preferred spending her time in Italy with the locals, but her and Kercher were friends, with the two attending the Euro Chocolate Festival in mid-October and, on the 25th of October 2007, attended a classical music concert where Knox met Rafael Solicito, a 23-year-old computer science student at the University of Perugia, who Knox would go on to date, with Knox beginning to spend most of her time at his flat. Now, All Saints' Day in Italy takes place on November 1st, and is a public holiday. As such, the Italian residents of Via della Pergola 7, the 2 flatmates as well as the residents of the lower level, were no longer home. Meredith Kercher was last seen around 9 p.m. after having dinner with friends not too far from her apartment. Knox, in contrast, had spent the night at Rafael Solicito's flat. The next morning, November 2nd, is when things began to take a turn for the worse, though. Knox returned to the apartment to find the door open with drops of blood and Kercher's bedroom door locked. She called Kercher's phone, which she could normally be reached on, and when she didn't pick up, Knox called one of the Italian flatmates to say she thought something was wrong. Knox then returned with Solicito later in the day and tried to break down the still locked door to Meredith Kercher's room. They were unsuccessful, and after calling the police, who refused to break down the door as well, Filomena Romanelli's male friend did, which is when the body of 21-year-old Meredith Kercher was found covered by a duvet. Now, the key damning moment for Knox was the very disputed all-night interrogation that took place with Italian police, where Knox signed a confession written out in Italian that wrongfully placed her at the house the night of the murder and also accused Patrick Lumumba, her boss, of the crime. Police arrested Knox, Solicito, and Patrick Lumumba on November 6, 2007, eventually charging Knox and Solicito to life in prison for the crime, with charges against Lumumba being dropped a short time later thanks to numerous alibis from the customers he served that night at his bar. It would later be determined that there was no biological trace of Amanda Knox or Rafael Solicito in Kercher's bedroom. So why would Amanda Knox have said these things that were clearly not true? At her trial, Knox testified about her interrogation, saying that she had spent hours maintaining her original story that she had been with Solicito at his flat all night and had no knowledge of the murder. But the police did not believe her and had coerced and manipulated the 20-year-old. Knox even testified to being told, quote, that she probably did not remember well because she was traumatized and that she should try to remember something else, unquote, during her interrogation. Knox went on saying, quote, they said they were convinced that I was protecting someone. They were saying, who is it? Who is it? They were saying, here's the message on your telephone. You wanted to meet up with him. You are a stupid liar. In addition to the strong verbal interrogation tactics, Knox also said that a policewoman was saying, come on, remember, and then slapping Knox in the back of the head. Furthermore, she had reportedly requested a lawyer but was told it would make things worse for her and that she would go to jail for 30 years. She also said she was not allowed access to food, water, or the bathroom, although most of this was disputed by the officers who conducted the interrogation. The confession itself was much later ruled inadmissible in court, with Amanda Knox and her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito, ultimately being acquitted of the crime after Europe's top human rights court ruled that she had been deprived of adequate legal aid during an interrogation, and that the DNA evidence used to convict her was flawed. The court ordered Italy to pay her $21,000 in damages, but this was after she had already served 4 years for the wrongful conviction. Now it turns out that Rudy Guade, the acquaintance of Knox and Kircher, who was a known burglar, was convicted of the crime after his bloodstained fingerprints were found at the scene and his DNA was found on and inside Kircher's body. Guade was tried separately from Knox and Solicito and convicted before their trial even began. He even testified that he sat with Meredith Kircher as she died, didn't call the police, and quote, talked about the amount of blood for 10 minutes. He had even fled to Germany before being extradited back to Italy. Rudy Guade was eventually sentenced to only 16 years for his crimes. To be treated so harshly by police in an interrogation, wrongfully accused of murder, and then made to spend 4 years in prison for the crime, that's all bad enough. But it was the media's constant barrage of attacks on Amanda Knox that made everything so much worse. In Italy, juries are not sequestered, meaning they aren't kept segregated from the public and can easily be influenced by media. It's also incredibly common for police and lawyers to leak information to the press, which resulted in a lot of media coverage. Almost before the actual victim's name had been fully revealed, reporters had gone snooping, finding images of the victim on the Halloween before her passing, but they had also gone digging through the social media of Amanda Knox and her then boyfriend as well. They found pictures of her posing with an antique weapon, which they used alongside the name Foxy Knoxy, which was apparently a perfect evil-inspiring name for the tabloids to run with, but was in actual fact a third-grade soccer nickname for Amanda. They ran with the stories that included the prosecution's theories of satanic games, Miss Knox doing cartwheels in the police station, which was just yoga, shopping for lingerie with her boyfriend because she had no underwear, and wearing a shirt that said, quote, all you need is love, which is from the Beatles song. They made light of the murder itself, calling it a perfect crime in a medieval town. They called Amanda Knox crazed because she kept a toy in her bathroom and a list of partners she wrote in a journal because the police told her she had contracted HIV when she actually hadn't. They said that she was diabolical, that she didn't flush the toilet, and that she had blue eyes of ice. And these weren't just tabloids in Italy. In England, the home of Meredith Kircher, tabloids had free reign over the speculation of guilt or innocence since the crime had taken place in a different country, freeing them of the laws that would normally stop such things, which allowed them to report without limits. When she was finally released from prison, Amanda Knox had to be taken to a safe house before her flight home, whose touchdown was covered by the news. Meredith Kircher's name had largely moved to the background, the same with her actual killer and the innocence of Amanda Knox. So, where is Amanda Knox now? About a year after she returned home, Amanda Knox's acquittal was overturned and she was retried and reconvicted in absentia. By the time she was fully acquitted in 2015, Miss Knox had been convicted, imprisoned, acquitted, and released on an appeal, in which time she had finished up her undergraduate degree in creative writing at the University of Washington, was retried and convicted again, and finally was exonerated by Italy's Supreme Court. She and her mother were also tried and acquitted of slandering the Italian police. She also faced charges that she had defamed Mr. Lumumba, and she was sentenced to 3 years for that crime, which she had obviously already served. Her public perception and identity was skewed and constantly being watched. She would travel at night to avoid cameras, and she would try and lay low for the most part, but she was fiercely against the question of her innocence. She was constantly and furiously trying to clear her name. She would go on to write a book about her experience titled Waiting to be Heard, a memoir, and Knox would also later work as an advocate for others who were incarcerated for crimes they did not commit. In a New York Times interview with Jessica Bennett, published in October of 2021, Amanda, 34 at the time, and her husband, Christopher Robinson, had just had their first baby together, and had been documenting the pregnancy on a podcast called Labyrinths. They were living on Vashon Island in Washington State, far enough away from Seattle and the mainland to avoid too many prying eyes. Her past being watched over by media outlets, with any move she made being turned into a story that was undoubtedly skewed in any number of ways, has clearly had an effect on her. All in all, I believe Amanda is just trying her best to control the narrative surrounding her and move on with her life for the good of her daughter and her own health and sanity.